guess just for starters, I'm going to say that I'm obviously half Chinese. My father's second generation Chinese. Both of his grandparents were born in China and moved over. And that's kind of what I want to focus on here is like, that's what I want to tell about. Like, what really means a lot to me and more about my personality than per se my mother's side of the family, which was, for all points of the word, is white. You know, my great-grandfather came to Canada as a 14-year-old in 1925 to meet his dad. But eventually he went back to the original village. The original village is in the Canton region of China, so both my grandparents are Cantonese speakers, and he is specifically from a small village in the Hoisan region called Qufei. Came to China, went to Canton, got married. My grandfather was born in 1932, and then he proceeded to move back to Canada and start raising money again to bring them over at some point. My grandfather grew up in the village, but during World War II was actually when my grandfather lost contact with his dad. My great-grandfather was in China, while my great-grandmother and grandfather remained in the village. It wasn't until 1945, when World War II ended, when turmoil began in China. The ruling Nationalist Party was starting to be uprooted by the communists, and at that point, my great-grandfather decided that it wasn't safe anymore to be there, and pulled both my grandfather and my great-grandmother and brought them over in 1950. My grandfather, when he came to Canada, because there was only a few places where you could get in and out of Asia, had to drive about 6 hours from his small little village to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong he flew over. Whereas my great-grandmother actually had to take a boat and took the full journey across the Pacific. So my grandfather was 17 years old at the time, and my grandfather said he just started by working at the restaurant his grandfather, or his father had worked at. And he went to school here. He said he went to art school in the day, and then went to the restaurant at night to help clean dishes, cook, all the little things that make a restaurant run. So I thought that was really kind of interesting. On my grandmother's side of the family, it's a little bit different, but again, a very similar story. So initially, my grandmother's father moved from China and ended up settling in Cranbrook, of all places, which is in southeast BC. And he moved there because his brother was there. So my grandmother's father ended up coming back to China for a bit when he was 18 years old, and that's when World War II broke out. And he decided to actually go back to his village as well and started a jewelry store. And there he got married and had 3 kids. Much like my grandfather in 1950, when the communists and the nationalists started going to war in China, they decided that it was time to leave. But rather than settling back in Vancouver, they decided to settle in Cranbrook, where they had family. And so at that point, my grandmother was 14 years old. My grandmother decided when she was 21 years old to come to Vancouver for school, and that's ultimately where she met my grandfather. And kind of by coincidence that they met each other, they realized that they're from both the Canton region and specifically, Hoisan village. Although the two villages were separated by about 4 hours worth of car drive, it was close enough, and that their cultures were still very similar.
And the way they got to Canada from China.
Yeah.
Both had similar reasons.
Both had similar reasons to come, because they were both, scared off by the communists coming through. So my grandparents met in 1957, and then were married in 1959. And then from there, the rest is kind of history. But
it really shows you, how small the world is know, people always say like, oh, we live in such a small world, and
Yeah.
like a story like that is pretty much it's the nail on the head, you know.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to hear. Yeah, it was perfect. I loved it.